Hello, and welcome to TDM for the Win, how test data management enables continuous testing. I'm Jeff Peoples, Senior Product Manager over the functional side of the continuous testing platform and continuous quality platform, excuse me. And we have with me Wilhelm Hocker, who is our Director of Solution Engineering.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Wilhelm. A little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions, then just enter them under the question mark icon, and I will pose those questions to Wilhelm at the end of our session. Also, I'm showing these slides from my desktop, and so if they're blurry, you might want to adjust your visual settings to make it any clearer as you need to. Okay, so in this webinar, we're going to look at some of the challenges that we face regarding test data, and then Wilhelm will help us explore some practical examples of how test data management can help you as you're looking to shift left in order to advance from an automated testing to a continuous testing practice. So let's start with what we mean when we say shift left. Okay, shift left has become a buzzword that basically what we're talking about here is shifting left the identification of defects to earlier in the SDLC where they cost less to find and fix. Now, this chart was defined in 1996 by Capers-Jones, and it's still relevant today. Companies are just doing it faster because now they're agile. And so what Capers found was that most software defects are introduced during the coding phase of development, but most defects are actually found during the later stages where it costs much more and is more risky to fix, find, and remove that defect, up to 640 times more than had they been found in the initial coding phase. So what we're focused on is shifting left the identification of those defects earlier in the SDLC by leveraging earlier stage quality practices such as deep code analysis or including secure coding practices and unit testing, and with the end result in mind to reduce the number of defects that make it in at the beginning and thus reduce those that make it in to the later phases, or at worst case, after release. So one way of shifting left is to use service virtualization. And for this, we have Parasoft Virtualize, which gives you the ability to create a mock of the asset your application is needing to access. And that asset is yours and directly available to you. We find that with their existing test environments, many of our customers face what we call the ABCDs of test environment destabilizers. A, for availability, where the asset your application needs may not be available or may have limited availability. One customer described their scenario as taking a number and waiting for their time slot to test. B, for behavior. The asset may not be in the state you need it to be in for the particular test you're trying to run. When you virtualize your asset, it is simulated in the exact state it was in when you recorded it. C, for cost. Now, this one may be self-explanatory, but the asset you need may be costly to stand up or to run. And cost is also capable of impacting all the other destabilizers as well. And then the last is D for data, which is what this webinar is about. And many of our prospective customers come to us explaining that they can't get the right data. So like they can't get the report they want, or their dashboards aren't giving them the metrics they need for their particular business purpose, or they need an efficient way outside of traditional test data management to protect personally identifiable information. We've done some internal market research ourselves, and we've found that the real costs to business associated with test data can be up to 60% of application development and testing time is devoted to data-related tasks. Many project overruns, such as 46% cost and 71% schedule, are due to inefficiencies in test data provisioning, and 20% of the average SDLC is lost simply waiting for data. System functionalities are not adequately tested, and test data is not being available or created as a result. And this leads to defects in production, that number of defects that we saw at the very beginning. So as it turns out, these customers didn't necessarily have data problems. They had service virtualization problems. And with Parasoft, you create that virtual asset from recorded traffic. And you also get a virtual test data management capability that you control, where it will help you avoid painful database refresh cycles that take too long to fit within the speed of Agile. Parasoft's data repository is designed to handle hierarchical data and give users free rein to generate data, snapshot data, subset data, reset data, and share data. But there's a problem with the traditional approach of test data management. In today's modern software architectures, we know applications to data sources access via APIs. And in many cases, these data sources are shared across multiple applications and teams. We also know that traditional TDM takes time. Specialized skills that are required, and escalating costs make traditional TDM costly and problematic, causing many companies to minimize its usage or avoid it altogether. And when teams start testing their applications that have a dependency on these shared data sources, conflicts and data pollution can frustrate teams that are trying to run automated regression testing in a reliable manner. And this can result in firefighting exercises, such as that regression testing and data conflicts and just trying to resolve all this, but rather a data or an environmental problem that causes your tests to fail. Each application team needs this shared test data that sits behind these APIs. And service virtualization is a logical fit for these use cases because it enables teams to independently control their own virtual sandboxes, which allows them to more easily drive higher levels of test automation that just isn't practical with traditional methods. In fact, teams need to control the generation, cloning, subsetting, and resetting of their virtual test data so that they can stabilize their automated testing as well as shift it to the left, where they can start their testing cycles without having to wait. Now back to virtualization. Once we've established a virtual asset, how do we manage our test environment, telling virtualize which one we want to use, that live asset or the virtual one? And the answer is to institute a proxy between our backend and our application under test. And this proxy acts as a traffic cop, directing the traffic that originally required the live asset to be available to now direct the requests instead to that virtual asset. And now, wouldn't it be great to have a user-friendly graphical interface to manage these test environments this clearly and direct those proxy traffic cops whether to use virtual or live assets? Well, that interface is Parasoft's Continuous Testing Platform, or CTP. Look familiar? CTP also provides us with Test Data Manager, which references the data sources in our data source server. And in this case, one I have running on localhost. And all the data sources I have available. I can view these data sources in a hierarchical text-based format, as well as a tabular, like a spreadsheet, the way we're used to viewing databases. Or I have the option of viewing my databases graphically as well. So I'll just click on my model, and we're presented with what looks like a scatter diagram. But if we zoom in, we see that these blue dots are actually each of my nodes in my data source, and the orange rectangles are the data fields associated with that node. And these data source structures can be generated for you using recordings, or you can build them manually or by using SQL select queries to select the data you want from an external database. However I build them, I have the ability to graphically step through the model to locate specific data nodes I'm interested in, or I can key in a keyword, say like category, and it will narrow in on just that node I'm looking for. And I can zoom in and out and even drag to pan the model to visually navigate the model to the node and to the data fields that I'm targeting. And from here, I have the option of either masking existing data, say to obfuscate email addresses, names, or I can generate an entirely new data set from scratch from given data field patterns, such as an SSN string that's 3 digits, hyphen 2 digits, hyphen 4 digits. And if you're not familiar with every field in the data model, or you just don't want to have to specify a format for each field in the data source, you can just let the AI do the heavy lifting for you and infer constraints, telling it to analyze the data you have and to detect the patterns for you that it can then use to generate test data values according to those patterns. An extremely valuable tool when considering how personally identifiable information has to be protected. And that brings us to our demonstration. And so I will pass it off to Wilhelm.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Give me one moment, let me get the screen share going. All right, so you should be seeing my browser window right now. We're looking at the Parabank application. Jeff, can you just confirm that it's you're seeing it okay?
Yep, we see it.
Awesome. So I'm going to be using Parabank as our demo application today. And Parabank, much like the name implies, right? It's I can log in as a user or a customer. I can see various accounts here for my John Smith account. And what I'm going to do is actually use that traffic cop that Jeff was talking about to switch from the live system of Parabank to a virtual core banking services that Parabank is using, right? This UI is built on top of APIs. So like these accounts and balances and things in the accounts overview, this is coming from an API call. And so much like Jeff was saying, right, if you're trying to get your functional testing or system level testing done in a lower environment, right, say your dev environment where many organizations may not have all of the components or data available in their dev environment to perform all the tests that they would normally run in a later stage. Service virtualization kind of comes to the rescue here to help teams shift left and be more agile. So we're looking at the environment manager component of CTP, our continuous testing platform. And I've diagrammed out a system for Parabank, and I've got a couple environments here. So we're looking at the QA environment right now. Now, I'm sure you wish your application architecture was this simple, but you can imagine all of these different boxes here will correspond to different components that are integrated together, right? So here I'm kind of modeling the browser connecting to the web server. Right, the front end is talking to the core banking services, which we want to virtualize. So I've implemented a virtual service called Virtual CRUD, and I'm going to provision my QA environment now to use that virtual service rather than the real banking service. And I did it through the web interface, but I want to also point out that we have REST APIs behind our solution. So anything that you see that I'm doing through the UI can also be automated as part of a DevOps pipeline. So here we give you a nice helper text with a curl command. You can call an API that provisions the environment the way you need. So if we come back to Parabank now, and I refresh the page here, we can see that I've got 12 accounts for my John Smith user, and this is coming from my virtual service. Now, before we get into how the virtual service is doing this and start exploring what we can do with test data, I want to point out that service virtualization is more than just static mocking of data, right? Or just sending you know, data that doesn't change. For a lot of the test cases that you'll need to run, you'll want your virtual service to handle CRUD, or create, read, update, delete, right? Kind of dynamic data sources. So let's see that in action, right? If I come in and create a bunch of accounts, right? The UI is making a different API call that says, create me an account. So I'm going to do this a bunch of times here. And right, if this was just static data, you would expect that the accounts overview doesn't change when I click it. But if we come back to the accounts overview, you'll notice that the table has grown, right? We have all these additional accounts that got added to our table. So at this point, I'm going to jump into Virtualize and show you the virtual service that's responsible for serving this data. And then from there, we'll explore how that managing that data will work. So here we're looking at Virtualized Desktop. And here we've got my Parabank CRUD virtual asset. And you'll notice I've kind of modeled a variety of resources for the Parabank application. This customer accounts is what is returning data for our accounts overview table that we're seeing. And you'll notice that Virtualize is a no-code solution. So you don't have to be a developer, you don't have to know how to write code to be able to virtualize a service. And so this can be great for QA teams, right, that are working in an Agile environment and they need to simulate a dependency to the application that they're testing. Developers can obviously use this as well and work closely with QA on their projects. And so here we've got all the data being parameterized from our data repository data source. And as Jeff mentioned, our data repository is purpose-built to handle hierarchical data. So from the desktop, I can come in and see, okay, I just have one row of data here for my customer that I'm logging in with, John Smith. And here we've got all of the account details that we're seeing on the browser. So that's how the table is getting data from our virtual service. Now, the CRUD part of this comes with the create account operation, right? We're creating an account, and here is where we're implementing that CRUD workflow. So I'll quickly walk you through how this is working. Basically, we're taking the customer ID from the incoming request. We're grabbing the account type, right? Is it checking or a savings account? And then here we're generating some data, right? A random balance, for example, between $100 and $200, right? There's some additional fields that you need for a new account that we're just generating here. Same with the account ID, right? We're just saying, give us a random number or a random string with 5 numbers, like so. So very easy to even generate data just in time without having to write a single line of code. And here, the CRUD tool, this is really what's enabling that workflow. So because my virtual service the data is decoupled from the definition of the service, I can handle the create account request and then use the incoming data from that create account request to augment the data source we have that this customer accounts response is using to respond with. And so here we are choosing which row to update the data, right, based on the customer ID. If I had multiple logins, we would update the correct row that way. And then here we're doing our update, and we've got a variety of options depending on what kind of workflow you want to implement. We give you a nice UI to say what do you want to update in the data source, right? It can be a complex data structure, and right, what are we updating it with? Well, we give you a nice UI for the JSON here. We're parameterizing from the data that we're pulling from the request or generating just in time. And that's really how it works. And so pretty straightforward to implement even some realistic behaviors that handle, adding new records to your system or deleting records or updating records. These are a lot of the test cases that you wish you could run earlier in the process, but you just might not have the data or the systems available to do that in your lower environments. So now I'm going to come back to the browser here, and we're going to talk about test data. So one of the other components in CTP is a test data component. And here I've got my data repository server that's running in Docker. And let's look at that same data that we saw from the desktop right through the web interface. So users can come in. You don't even need virtualized desktop to come in, work with your data. I can make edits here if I like. But the first thing I want to talk about before we get into data generation and modeling is resetting your data. So, what are the tricky things about test automation is if you're running test scenarios that involve changing the data, the pipelines that you're running are expecting repeatability, right? You want an easy way to reset the data back to a known state, right? The beginning of before you ran any of your tests. So I want to show you how we do that. So here in my data repository server, I have a number of exports, and these are basically what we call the snapshots of a data set that we may want to re-import to that particular repository. And so again, I want to point out that, right, this could also be an API call. And so I'll do it here manually through the UI. So we can see that data reset in action. Now, if I come back to Parabank, we'll see that we've got our 12 accounts that we started with before I created any new accounts. So very easy to take a virtual service, run through all your scenarios that you need. It'll be changing data as you go, as you need it to. But then you can reset back so you can run that pipeline over and over again. Now, what if you don't have the data you need, right? How can we generate data to fit the different test scenarios we have? And so this is where our data modeling component comes in. So regardless of whether you recorded network traffic using our message proxies, or you just built a virtual service from a service definition like a Swagger or a WSDL, you may not have all the data you want your virtual service to have. So here, we're taking a look at the structure of the payloads, right? The response payload for this accounts table, and I've configured some data generation settings. Like for example, the balance I've set up to be between -1,000 and +10,000. Right, the account number, similar to what we did in the CRUD tool in our virtual service. I just gave it a string with a certain number of numbers in it. And you can also do other things like pulling from a seed data source, right? Maybe you have certain fields that are valid, or certain data that's valid for a field, like checking savings or credit card as account types. You can upload those data sets into data repository and then reference them with your data generation, right? So if it's not random data, but you need to pick from a certain set of data for a field, you can easily do that for your generation settings here. And we can also change the shape, right? How many accounts do I want to generate for this scenario? And so I've set up, between 40 and 50 accounts, right? Originally we have 12. And so if I come in, I can generate that data again, also with a curl command or an API call. This can easily be automated. Now, what I'm going to do is not do it through the UI here, but I'm going to show you another part of our solution here that really helps to enable the DevOps workflows that you might be looking to implement. Part of our solution involves not just service virtualization, but API testing. So you can automate test scenarios, verify responses, all of that as part of our continuous quality platform. But what I'm going to be using this for here is to automate a workflow where I'm calling the Parasoft APIs to generate data and then update my virtual service to use that newly generated data source. So I can string together multiple actions through our APIs and run it as an easy workflow, right? I can just, instead of trying to script out, these various API calls to do something more complex in an automated way, I can build a test in SOA test similar to Virtualize. It's a no-code solution for API testing. I can build it out and then have, again, a nice, simple single call to automate a more complex workflow that'll do what I need. So once this goes through and completes, let's come back and take a look at our Parabank system now. Right, so now I can see between 40 and 50. Can't count exactly how many it is, but we can see our data generation settings were respected, right? All these accounts are between 10,000 and negative 1,000. All our random account numbers are there. And so this can be really useful for teams that are exploring different scenarios related to data to make sure their application is handling things correctly. One of the reasons that people value, taking production data, sanitizing it, and pushing it to lower environments for testing is because there's so much data to work with in production, right? And there's corner cases that you don't think of when you're testing that can help you expose defects right before a customer does. And so with the data generation, you can apply some of those principles of, what are the corner cases around data that we should be testing for? And then how do we easily generate it to make sure that our application handles it correctly? Well, here, now that I have a wealth of accounts in my accounts overview, I can see, a simple issue where there's no commas, right, in this dollar amount for total, right? If I just had a few accounts in my dev environment, I might not see how the system formats large numbers when it's adding all the balances up together, right? So little things like this you can miss if you don't have the right data when you're doing your testing. So similarly to before, workflows can also reset data. So we can come back in and say, okay, let's switch our virtual service back to our snapshot. Let's not use the generated data source anymore. Let's go back to the beginning so we can run more pipeline jobs. So we can also automate workflows like that. So we come back in, and once this is done, we'll see we'll see our 12 accounts that we started with. All right, so we could spend a lot of time here going through the details, but a couple last things I'll mention around data. Jeff mentioned earlier that you can infer constraints, you can subset data, mask data. So these workflows are useful because if you're recording and generating data, you may need your virtual service to handle different requirements for testing. Especially like we saw here, if I'm generating a bunch of data with accounts that have negative balances, positive balances, or different account types, I may have a scenario where I want to subset this large data source to only have accounts that are negative or only have accounts of a certain type. Right? So we can set up the constraints on the large data set and then subset out what we want with our data requirements, and then use that subsetted data source to drive different test scenarios. So some nice flexibility here from a data management perspective to help you work with getting the data you need to drive the test scenarios that you need to run as in an automated way. Okay. So I think with that, Jeff, I'll pass it back to you, and we can proceed.
Okay, thank you, Wilhelm. Okay, so just to review what we've touched on, Service Virtualization gives you the ability to simulate API endpoints for your applications that you use to retrieve or update data. Test Data Management provides you that full CRUD capability that Wilhelm showed us for dynamic virtual data sources. And we can combine the two with TDM and model the data relationships to generate, mask, reset, subset, and share data. And so what conclusions can we come to? Service Virtualization allows us to shift left our integration testing to earlier in the SDLC, where it costs less to fix. You can share data between test tools and not be constrained by the backend system. Data storage is simplified rather than having to duplicate entire schemas, which can take days. And lastly, TDM allows you to create different data sets for different purposes and different use cases, both positive and negative. You can do the happy path, or you can simulate error conditions, which can be challenging when testing a backend that's not completely under your control. And Parasoft Virtualize for Service Virtualization, which includes TDM, is just one aspect of our continuous quality, fully integrated test environment management solution. Selenic is our UI testing tool that adds powerful capabilities to a Selenium testing practice, such as coverage, test impact analysis, and self-healing. SOATest for a no-code, low-code solution to functional API security and compliance testing. Virtualize, which we went over, and CTP, which we showed you, which has more features than TDM, including that graphic web-based way to manage your test environments and have those traffic cops direct traffic. And DTP, which is your situation room mission control for consolidating and managing your entire testing practice and to know where you are to determine where you need to go next. Together, combined with our code analysis and unit testing language-based products, comprise Parasoft's entire continuous quality platform. And we want to invite you to have a voice in guiding the future of Parasoft products. You can check out forums.parasoft.com and learn more about submitting your product ideas, or you can upvote others' ideas. And if you're not yet a member, just create your account to get started. It's a great place to interact with other Parasoft customers, to ask questions and get answers. And be sure to visit our website to access blogs, white papers, and other useful resources, and contact us with any questions. So now we'd like to move on to our Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, then please post those while I go through some that have already been submitted. Okay, question number 1. Do you only support XML and JSON, or does your solution work with other data formats like EDI, fixed length, protobuf, and others?
I'll take that, Jeff. So yes, we support a variety of data formats, including the ones referenced in the question. And I should also point out that Virtualize and SOATest have an extension framework where customers can extend support for proprietary message formats as well, right? You may be working in an industry where certain protocols have a proprietary format, and Virtualize can be extended to handle those as well.
Oh, great. Here's a good one. One of our data challenges stem from data aging issues. Our test scenarios rely on data to represent certain business rules around dates and times. How does your solution help with that?
Oh, that's a great question. So with the data modeling and generation features that I showed, our users can automate the workflows that will refresh time-sensitive data sets to fit the parameters of their test cases. And even if you need a virtual service to return timestamps at the time of execution, right? We saw in that virtual service and virtualized desktop that I was showing, our data generator tool can be used to do that, right? If you need the current date and time in a virtual service response, or a week ago from today's date and time, or even something more complex, like you take a date from the request and then you offset that date in various fields in the response. All those types of things can easily be configured. So yeah, we have customers doing that today.
Okay, great. Okay, next is, how can I feel confident that my end-to-end system is well tested if I'm using virtual services instead of real ones?
That's a great question. So the goal of service virtualization isn't to replace that fully integrated system level testing stage that you have. Service virtualization gives you that ability to start running those automated integration tests earlier in the development lifecycle, right? We're talking about shift left at the beginning of the presentation. So this means that your dev and QA environments, before that build makes it all the way to, system integration test or pre-prod, or, however you describe it, you can start running those test scenarios early and start catching these issues early where they're cheaper to fix. So by the time you do get to those later stages and you are running your tests against all the live components, you're less likely to find these late stage issues where it's much more costly to implement a fix before release.
Okay, great. We had somebody here say they joined late, but was wondering which Parasoft tool is required. Yes, Parasoft Virtualize is the tool required with test data management. Anything you want to add there, Wilhelm?
No, that's
okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And so we have our last question. So if you have any other questions, please get those in. How does this differ from traditional test data management?
All right. So what we see with most companies that we work with is that they've invested in these traditional TDM tools, and then they were surprised by how complex they are to implement, right? It takes specialized skills, which can be hard to find, and it ends up resulting in a lot of failed implementations. So with our approach, it's not necessarily to say that you shouldn't do traditional TDM, or you shouldn't take production data, sanitize it, and put it in your lower environments. Service virtualization can be an optimizer to that whole workflow. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but it takes time, right? And those data refreshes don't always work at the speed of Agile. So with service virtualization, you can start getting the data you need into your lower environments to fit with that goal of in-sprint testing. It can be a much more cost-effective solution to get you rolling with your Agile workflow.
Okay, great. Thank you all for the great questions, and thank you, Wilhelm, for your thorough demonstration. If you'd like to see more detailed and personalized demonstration, then please contact us via the URL you see on the screen, requested customized demonstration. And or you can always contact us on the parasoft.com/contact form. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Wilhelm.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye.